The Simpsons.
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons, to trace its creative evolution and count down, finding the exact moment in which the show began to suck. I'm your host, Erix and Antoine, and this week I'm once again joined by my friend Petrus. We are discussing the episode The Call of the Simpsons, which originally aired on February 18th, 1990. We focus almost entirely on the episode itself. This is arguably the most kid-friendly episode, certainly in the first season. So we discuss that, how its specific kiddie appeal was probably engineered and eventually exploited. We talk also about the difference in watching this as a kid from watching it as an adult. And that difference can be summed up basically in Cowboy Bob, the sleazy car salesman hilariously portrayed by Albert Brooks. It goes without saying that we both agree Albert Brooks is the highlight of the episode, and so the entire first act, of which his appearance is the centerpiece, is our favorite part. But the whole episode is still considered a classic, and rightly so. Now, please get comfortable wherever you are, in transit, treadmill, or toilet, and join us for this hopefully engaging discussion. Here we go. Welcome back. How you doing today, Petrus?
I'm great. Thank you for having me again. It was really fun last time, and I liked this episode better.
Yeah, well, this is actually the one that when I invited you to do this, this is the one that I told you which episode would you like to do. You had chosen this one originally. I basically assigned you the other one because I needed you to do me a favor because nobody wanted to do Homer's Odyssey.
Okay.
But in your case,
okay. But this one's a classic, I think.
Right. Well, I mean, I wanted to start there actually. So, why did you want this one? Why did you choose this one? Because yes, it is definitely a classic, but you have a personal connection to it, right?
I liked it when I was a kid. It's one of the very first episodes I watched.
Wasn't it the first one you ever watched?
Probably it was. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was. But it's also they're in the forest. It's not like a normal Simpsons episode. It's not their home. It's out of the ordinary, and I like that about this episode. And of course, if you rewatch it, the stuff I remember from when I was a kid is basically the RV and the forest and Homer covered in mud and the bears, of course, which is more like a children's. It has this magical fable thing, I think.
Right. Well, the one thing, you said that it was the first one you saw, or one of the first ones you saw when you were a kid. And so, here are the two things. First of all, as you said, most of it takes place in the woods. It is probably the first one that kind of steps out of the normal Simpsons environment. It steps out of Springfield. Yeah. It is the first one that's kind of outlandish, kind of goes to wild places too.
And I read that they made an effort for the branches and all the animals and to make it look convincing. The animation department, which is they were really trying to create something out of the ordinary, and it was even picked on that they had Burger King figurines.
Right.
So that you can, you can tell they knew this episode was special, sort of.
Right.
When they were making it.
Yeah, it had a Burger King kids meal. Right. That was my next point. Is that on top of it being kind of outlandish, the first one was kind of wild in terms of its story. It's the first, let's call it an unrealistic cartoon type story.
Yeah, exactly.
This could not be right.
It's also really fun, of course.
It's fun, and it seems aimed at kids. It's the most kid. It's the first. I would say even of the first season, it's probably the most kid friendly of all of them. If you're going to introduce a kid to The Simpsons, it's a good one to show them because it has a lot of stuff that they're going to find funny just visually or just the way the story is because it's wild. It's very kid friendly, I think, in comparison with some of the other ones.
Yeah, and it's not just the fact that they're in the woods. It's also because Homer's antics are just really stupid, and like when they fling the rabbit like a slingshot. And
that's the funniest gag.
What are we gonna do? Hang ourselves?
No, this is a trap. It's gonna catch us our dinner. Come on, boy. Shh. Just watch. Aha! Got him.
I read somewhere that there was a scene with Marge and Lisa. They were talking about boys, and maybe that could have been. I would like it better if they had explored that scene and those two characters a little bit more. It was aimed at kids. I think you're right in that regard, except for the first sequence. The first scene is I think it's wonderful. Albert Brooks does a wonderful job. And it's the kind of thing, when you rewatch it, when I rewatched it, I thought it was a lot funnier. This character, Cowboy Bob. And when you're a kid, you don't really, it's like the most forgettable scene in the episode when you're a kid. You just want them to get the RV and get to it and get into the forest and whatever. But now I thought it was the best scene in the whole episode. Like, the only problem for an adult viewer is, like, I don't want to say it goes downhill from that point, but it's like the very best scene is this crazy scene, this crazy character. And I read Albert Brooks improvise a lot, so you don't really know.
Yeah, that's what he does.
So which part was his creation or whatever, or which part was improvised. But the whole thing is outrageous. I thought it was a really, really fun scene, the stuff he says.
Yeah.
And he's like a con artist or something.
Well, he's a car salesman.
Yeah, but
A cliched car salesman.
he says stuff like,
But I don't own the place, even though my name's up there. Long story.
it's beautiful.
Right.
And this was,
Seems the ultimate behemoth is a wee bit out of your price range. And wee bit is me being polite. You couldn't afford this thing if you lived to be a million.
what an asshole. I mean, that's beautiful. Or this one.
Mr. Simpson, if you have to go talk it over with those humans out there, then there's something wrong with all of us.
Was he making that up? I don't know, but it's brilliant. The whole scene is brilliant.
It would not surprise me if Albert Brooks ad-libbed at least 90% of that performance.
Uh-huh.
In a later episode, where he plays the bowling instructor.
Yeah, Jacques.
Right, that's also Albert Brooks.
Yeah,
And
I know.
again, that was totally an ad-lib. In fact, in the original script, the character was a Swedish tennis instructor.
Oh.
And because Albert Brooks said, I can probably do a French accent a lot better, it'll be funnier, let's make him French. And so they changed everything because they cast Albert Brooks in the role. So the same thing here. I mean, they cast Albert Brooks as a sleazy car salesman and basically told him, I'm sure they gave him carte blanche, because this is Albert Brooks. He's not just some guy off the street. And I think this is his first appearance on The Simpsons. I think this is his first appearance. He did frequent characters, but it was his first one.
It was his first one. He didn't use his own name. It was just something like A. Brooks because he wasn't into, animation. It was a first scene. They didn't really know what The Simpsons was going to be. Scorpio or the other characters, it was his own name. He must have been thrilled to do them. But
right, by that point.
First season, they were a little cautious, I think. He
When-
must have liked it, though.
He probably had fun doing it because otherwise he wouldn't have come back to do
This
Jacques
other
and
one.
the other ones.
Mr. Simpson, you're never going to own a better RV. And I don't mean that in a good way. I mean literally, buddy. This is it for you, It's this or a wagon.
He's an asshole, but I love the character. And I mean, the whole scene is brilliant. And it's my favorite now. But when I was a kid, it was, of course, Bears.
I completely agree with you because having rewatched it recently myself, I prefer the whole first part of the episode, like
First
sequence.
act.
The first act, before they go to the woods. That's my jam. That's what I enjoy. Not to say that there isn't some fun stuff that happens later. Obviously, there's some funny gags, but
even the Flanders stuff is
the Flanders thing, the whole first act of the show that appeals to me. I find that funny. Obviously, the entire sequence at the car dealership is absolute gold because of Albert Brooks primarily. All of that is hilarious, and then then it becomes a kids show basically. Then it becomes a Burger King Happy Meal, and I think that has its merit.
But basically, like this tagline.
The Simpsons have entered the forest.
Lisa says that. I mean, the episode is about that commercially, I think. I mean, in terms of how they pitched it to Burger King, it was The Simpsons have entered the forest.
Right.
But the setting...
Yeah, the scene setting, the setup
The
You
setup,
know,
exactly.
is the part
yeah.
that's really funny in the
Exactly.
episode. The actual payoff in the forest, that's the part that appeals to kids. Obviously, you have a Burger King Happy Meal. They're dressed in camping gear, and the Simpsons kids meal for Burger King, it was the figures, but they came with like backdrops, with like
But
camping type
everything
backdrops.
is camping, right?
Right, it's all camping related. I
They
thought maybe
didn't
it
have
came with
Cowboy
the,
Bob.
they didn't have Cowboy Bob because again, that's not the kid friendly character. But it was like the figures, and they came with like camping gear and little backdrops.
Burger King's taking Homer, Marge, and all the Simpsons camping, including you-know-who.
Obviously, these things are planned in advance.
Yeah.
And when they looked at they knew that this would have to have marketing, and they're trying to sell a show here. This is everything about this episode. It almost seems like they engineered it to appeal to children.
Yeah, that's what I said. I mean, except for the setup, the first part, the first act, commercially, the whole thing, it appeals to kids, like you said.
Right.
But it's also, the way you pitch it around is the Simpsons are in the forest, they're in the woods,
Right. They have an adventure.
they have an
ultimately.
adventure,
It's an
they're
adventure.
getting out of their environment. And that's, it has a lot to do with Homer's enthusiasm, I think. Even when he's driving and that scene, the final scene of the first act, when he finally gets home and he wants to show Flanders his car, and he knows his car sucks in comparison.
Yeah, it's a piece of
And
shit.
It's a piece of shit. And he really thinks Flanders is going to be, like, jealous of him somehow. And it's absurd. And his whole family is like, seriously, dude? Because they know Flanders RV. And they're like, whatever. But he's still, like, so into it. And he really wants to take his family into this crazy adventure. They even say something about adventure, the fact that they lose everything.
Why, I bet there are people who would trade everything they have in the world for an adventure like this.
You mean like we just did?
They basically lose everything. All the stuff that was in the car, and of course he's going to have to pay this sleazebag $350 a month, right?
Right.
They established that.
Right. He's still gonna have to pay for it.
He's going to have to pay for it, and all the stuff they lost that was in the car. So it's a fucking disaster, you
Right.
know?
I mean, if he could barely afford that car, you can assume that he could barely afford. Well, first of all, that car was not going to have any insurance tied to
Yeah,
it.
of course.
No fucking way. It's a used car. It's a piece of shit. I mean, that's the end of it.
And all the stuff that was in the car. So they lost everything, and he's still like, okay, we're going to make the best of it. And apart from that moment where he's like,
I've murdered us all! I've murdered us all! I've murdered us all!
I like him. I like him in this episode. He's a complete idiot, of
Right.
course.
But a likable
And
character.
he's not an experienced woodsman or anything like that, but he's a good person somehow. I mean, and even, of course, the Bigfoot thing is outrageous and stupid. But it's funny somehow. And
It is funny. I mean, they pull it off in a funny way. Here's the thing about that.
They couldn't pull it off today, though.
No, they wouldn't go there. They wouldn't do something that silly. Although, I mean, I today, quote unquote, could mean anything because I haven't watched.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
anything lately.
I
but,
mean, the type of sketch you would do in humor nowadays.
yeah, I mean, even
Not the Simpsons.
when they were in their heyday in general, like when they were in their heyday, they would have not done something quite like this. But it's a very elaborate idea for a story, and it's not grounded. It's like you have this situation where what ends up happening at the end of this episode, the Simpsons, the family, certainly Homer, Marge, they would be celebrities, at least for a brief time. They would become celebrities because of everything that had happened. They would become famous. They wouldn't just be this family. It wouldn't be like that. And then we would see this later in other episodes. You know, we find out that Homer used to be part of a barbershop quartet that won Grammys. So he was a rock star for a while. Or you have the one where he enters a space program.
No.
You know, all this stuff that is
Over
obviously totally, it's outlandish. So it's the sort of thing that if this were true, if this were realistic, not true, but realistic, if this were realistic, they would be celebrities, right? Now there'd be book deals, movie deals, like who knows.
I know, but it's also like...
He's mistaken for Bigfoot, right? And they have all this, this whole crazy thing happens.
But the episode also, establishes the newsprint, the newsflash thing. It's crazy how fast it goes, right? Because they're still in the forest and
right. I mean, how long have they been there? You know, right?
Course, it's like
doesn't
a
make
week
sense.
goes by,
right?
Or
more.
Basically one night or two.
Right.
But you know how it all goes really fast, and it's like I married Bigfoot.
That's my husband. His name is Homer. What does it eat? I suppose pork chops are his favorite.
All in one day. All in one
so
day.
It's basically saying how it can be so fleeting somehow. It's news, but it's only news for like 2 days, and maybe they're celebrities for 2 days, and everyone forgets about them.
Well, yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, the Simpsons are ultimately, because that was one question that I had about this episode. It's a question that I have in general about a lot of it.
So basically, they are celebrities, but for a day or two.
Yeah, they're always trying to satirize things about society in these episodes, and obviously, ultimately what this is poking fun at is sensationalist media.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, the whole fleeting thing. You could look at the commentary about how fleeting it all is. How everybody's, they would be celebrities, but they would be celebrities for a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Because I was going to say, like, what is the timeline of this episode? What is the time frame? I mean, they get the RV. They go into the forest like the very next day or whatever it is for the weekend. Right, that's the idea. They're going to go camping for the weekend. They go into the woods. They lose the RV. They're stranded in the woods. They get separated.
It's one night, basically.
It's a one night. Because it's 2 days, one night. Because Maggie spends the night with the bears.
Exactly.
Right?
So the sensationalist media part is just, it doesn't make sense in terms of the time frame, but it's funny. Right. I mean, the fact that you step out of the woods, I mean, and the whole place has like Bigfoot memorabilia.
Yeah, immediately.
Like immediately,
right.
the next day, right?
There's kiosks, right, with balloons and shit. Right. It's very, again, outlandish, fast-paced storytelling where it's going more for the points they're making and the satire that they're making than for any kind of narrative coherence.
But they have a few like nice punchlines, like
this specimen is either a below-average human being or a brilliant beast.
Oh, Homer, my brilliant beast.
That's a cute button for the episode.
Yeah,
It's a cute way to end it. One thing I looked into, this apparently was also a satire of Bigfoot specials.
Yeah, I read that too.
And I'm going like, what Bigfoot specials? I mean, I was around the 90s. I don't remember any of that. I knew people were into, not into, but like I knew that there was the whole legend of Bigfoot. That existed. There was a legend of Bigfoot like in the 80s.
But this is 1990, right?
This is 1990, and I lived
in the States that year, and I do remember documentaries, but not exactly Bigfoot, but like strange stuff, right?
Sure.
Like freaks but it's it sounds like a late 80s sort of thing, right?
It is, because like I remember I had like around this is 89, 90, but I subscribed to, Time Life had that series of books, Mysteries of the Unknown. Each volume had something, and then like Lake Ness and the Loch Ness Monster, and I guess they probably touched on Bigfoot. I had a couple of those. I got the free one, and then like I bugged like my dad or some to like help to subscribe to it so I could get the rest, and so I got a couple of those Time Life books. I don't remember
it being like specifically Bigfoot.
No, there wasn't one on Bigfoot. I'm sure Bigfoot was included in one of the mysterious creatures or whatever.
There are so many hints of a world more remarkable than we ever imagined, and of abilities that we barely suspect. That's why Time Life takes a serious look into this world with a remarkable new series, Mysteries of the Unknown.
I don't remember specifically though. Like I don't remember that Bigfoot specifically was a thing. Yeah, there were a bunch of these things, like the Loch Ness Monster or the Abominable Snowman, but that goes back to like the 50s. I mean, there's a Bugs Bunny cartoon about the Abominable Snowman. You know what I mean? This has been going on. This has been going on for years by that point.
Yeah. My own little bunny rabbit. I will name him George, and I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him.
It might just be something that the writers who grew up in like the 60s.
Yeah.
That it might have been something that they kind of went like, oh yeah, like those Bigfoot specials. Let's do a satire of that. Because in 1990, I, for the life of me, cannot remember Bigfoot being a thing.
Not really.
You know,
It does sound more like something from
that the writers grew up with.
Yeah.
That they made an impact on them, so let's make fun of that.
Mommy, all I could think of was you.
I know.
Send for your first volume on a free trial basis and see if you can explain.
Because I'm sure there were tons of TV specials of Bigfoot and Loch Ness
Yeah,
Monster.
like in the 60s.
Right, and in the 60s, 70s, whatever. But there's that famous movie. It's a cult movie, the Legend of Boggy Creek, which is sort of like a mockumentary about a supposed legendary monster that lives in the woods. And it's not real, but it's done in the style of like a documentary from the 70s.
Okay.
It's from the 70s. The movie's from, and it's done in the style of that because I guess back then, all this stuff about the mysteries of these things, this is when it was happening in the 70s and in the 80s.
Is it meant to be funny, that one?
No. It's meant to be. Well, it's meant to be scary, quote unquote. But it's kind of like Blair Witch,
Okay.
but not really. Like if you watch it now, obviously it's not a real documentary right off the bat. And there's no way that anybody could have been fooled by it. But I think at the time, it was kind of a Blair Witch sort of thing going.
Josh!
But it's a fun episode.
Yeah, I think it's a great episode. But it's one of the first. Even Flanders, he doesn't really behave like Flanders, right? He's bragging about his RV. He has a satellite dish on his.
Right.
And Flanders, he watches Christian channels most of the time. He wouldn't do that.
Right. Well, here's the thing about Flanders. That's an interesting point you brought
later
up.
in the show, he wouldn't do that. He
Right.
wouldn't be so braggadocious,
Yeah, I think at this particular point, this is like Flanders, I guess his second appearance.
Yeah.
Because he'd been in the Christmas episode. And I think at this point, they were just building him up to be like the more successful neighbor.
Yeah, of course.
Because, he
have
puts
to
up his Christmas
establish
lights.
the fact that Homer hates his guts.
Right, and he hates his guts because he's more prosperous. He's more like,
Exactly.
he's better. He
even likes his wife.
Right. And so but what they, like in the Christmas episode, I think they were trying to establish Flanders as a kind of rival to Homer. Like he would always have the cooler stuff. Because in the Christmas episode, he puts up his Christmas lights and they're like spectacular. You have this like Santa waving and whatever. And then now he shows up with his huge RV. I think at this point in the show, they had not really developed Flanders.
No, they did.
The whole religious thing happened later. The whole thing about him being Christian.
Yeah, but the way he talks, it's already there.
Oh, that's already there. Yeah.
And also the fact that he's just a really nice guy.
Right. That's another thing too. Where
Homer comes over with his own crappy RV. He's like, check this out, Flanders.
Right, and he's like really nice about it too. He goes like, "Oh, that's great,"
have fun. And
right, he's
really
like nice
about it.
He's nice about it.
Yeah, the way Flanders will always be. But
right.
At this point, I don't see Flanders being so over the top later on in the show.
Right.
And I like that because of course, you have to establish the fact that Homer hates him. But later on, he just hates him just because, right?
Right.
There's no particular reason for hatred. It's just not even about the fact that he likes his wife or the fact that Ned is more prosperous.
Right.
It's just he just hates him. He's like he can't stand his voice. But I like that. I like the very first scene. Bart is like, he's mowing.
What's the old hunk of junk?
Howdy, Bart. It's hot enough for you?
Shut up, Flanders. Hey, Dad. How come we can't get a decent mower like the Flanders have?
Just be happy with what you got, son. Don't try to keep up with the Flanderses.
It's like a morality play, isn't it? Because if you think about it, because of Homer's ambition, because of
envy more than anything.
His envy, because of his envy. Ultimately, the whole camping trip is built around that.
Yeah.
It's the reason that they even get the RV and then to go camping. It's just so you can show up Flanders, and because of that, they get into a big mess.
Yeah.
So you have that whole it's the whole thing about how envy will eventually destroy you, or it will lead you down a bad path, and you shouldn't.
They wind up losing everything.
It has that whole. A lot of these early episodes had that simplicity to them. That simplicity in the storytelling.
Like morality plays.
They were like morality plays. I see.
And maybe this fable-like atmosphere it has with the bears and everything responds to that. It has a little bit to do with the fact that it is a morality play. So the fact that I remembered the episode so like this dream-like thing, the Simpsons and the forest, and even like the music. I don't know, is it? Where did they get that music? Da, da, da.
So the song is "The Happy Wanderer." It's a German folk song.
Oh, it sounds German.
It was composed by Friedrich Wilhelm Möller after World War II. It's an original composition written in the 40s.
But it sounds like, an adventurous journey into the countryside. It works beautifully for that part of the episode, and it's one of the things I remembered about it, about the atmosphere and about the woods. And about
it's a very catchy tune.
Yeah, it is.
It's a very catchy tune.
What I remembered the most about this episode was this fable-like atmosphere and this music and the forest. And now, of course, as an adult, it's more the sleazy bastard from the beginning.
Right, that's the best part.
That's the best part.
The first act is very much classic Simpsons, not aimed at kids, whatever it is.
But once
they get to the
done,
forest, right, yeah.
It's a whole different thing. The second act is what I remember the most, but it works. And I like the fact that it's so different, the first part from the second part. All in all, I like both parts for very different reasons, and I like the contrast.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole thing about them going into the forest, getting lost, getting into an adventure, that almost could have been the plot of a movie, or it either could have been the plot of like a traditional children's animated show, or one that had more of a family audience type of thing, like the Flintstones.
Exactly, yeah.
Or it could have been the plot of like a Disney movie, like this family that gets lost in the woods, and like the baby gets...
And I'm sure every show does one episode in the woods. I'm sure there's like a Flintstones episode that like they get lost in the woods, or they have an adventure of sorts. I'm sure that every sort of family sitcom, they all explore that moment, that sort of frame, right? They all have to step into the woods at some point. So it's, considering it's the first season, it's nicely done. It's a good first attempt at getting the Simpsons out of their own environment, and it's something they're going to do a lot over the years. But considering it's one of their first attempts, I think it's beautiful, and I like this episode.
Avenge me, son. Avenge my death.
So what do we think of this episode? We've talked about it a lot, obviously, over. We've said it again and again, but basically we still like this episode, right?
I think it succeeds. It is very, kind of outlandish, but it works. And even today, I like it.
Yeah, I think it holds up. I think as a piece of, as a 22-minute short film that's funny and that is appropriate for like a family audience, I think it still works. It's funny. It has a lot of humor. And right, that whole first act, as we were saying.
And I like the fact that it's, both parts are appealing in very different ways.
Yeah. It's a lot like what Pixar became famous for.
Yeah.
When they make these family movies that have nice themes. They have elements that can appeal to children, obviously, but they also have complex kind of plotting or ideas that they throw in there that could appeal to adults. And it's not as clear cut as this. It's not like, you have the whole first act, which is clearly, it has all the adult quote unquote jokes are in the first act. And then, you go into the woods and it becomes...
But even The Simpsons, they managed to mix up both elements later on more successfully. I think, seasons 4 and 5 managed to do that more neatly.
I mean, I think what ended up happening, though, is that...
Pixar does it,
regularly. It's how they ended up doing. But the difference, I guess, is that Pixar, they're very much... they're family films. Their primary audience is children. They're marketing toys for children. They're making it for kids, but they make them sophisticated enough that they're hoping that the whole family will enjoy them. And there's enough going on with the humor and everything else that it will appeal to adults. But in the case of The Simpsons,
that's more layered.
Yeah, in the case of The Simpsons, it's not really. I don't know that they would ever do something quite like this again. I mean, in the first couple of seasons, you have things where they're, let's say, quote unquote, aimed at kids, but not so much. Eventually, like you said, it becomes more of a blending.
Yeah.
Where it's going
still
to
trying to
appeal to
figure
the
out
family.
their pace anyway.
Right. They're figuring that, it's more of a blending of things, but it is mostly aimed at, like, the humor, that part of it is definitely sophisticated and it's aimed at adults.
Yeah.
And then you have, like, the other stuff that kids will find entertaining, but it's there. But the plotting and everything, it really does become a lot more, quote unquote, adult.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything quite like this again, quite something as clear cut as The Family's Lost in the Woods, and you have a lot of slapstick humor.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we talked about,
slapstick, yeah.
The rabbit getting tossed into the woods and the thing, or the fact that Maggie gets lost and gets like adopted by a family of bears. That whole thing is very. That one thing is slapstick, and the other thing is that's very like sweet, and very cartoony, very like a kid's cartoon.
Yeah.
The baby gets adopted by the bears, like all that stuff. That's stuff that they would eventually move away from.
But it's great. It's hard to believe you have the bears in the same episode where you have Cowboy Bob saying stuff like, it's this or a wagon.
Right. Right.
It's crazy. It's the same episode,
right.
But it's just two extremes.
But that's also another thing where, and that's something that's consistent with The Simpsons, even in later seasons, where one thing that I think stands out about them is their structure, the way they structure their episodes, and you see that here. Because like in a normal sitcom, or let's say in a normal series, the first act is to set up the plot, right? And when you watch, say, an episode of Friends, right, whatever happens before the first commercial break, you know that they've already set up what the entire episode is going to be about. Mm-hmm. They've set up the conflict for the entire episode. They've set it all up in that first act, right? But The Simpsons doesn't really do that. The Simpsons, and this becomes consistent. If you look at like their first acts are almost in a lot of cases, and this is one of those cases, they're like disconnected in a certain way from what the rest of the episode turns out to be.
Yeah.
They start one way. So here it starts out about rivalry between Homer and Flanders, and you'd think in a traditional series or in a traditional story, that would be the conflict of the episode.
Yeah.
Their rivalry, which will then have to be resolved by the end of it, right? And that will be what it's about. And so it's about, so this is going to be a story of how Homer or how the Simpsons family is trying to one-up the Flanders family. Mm-hmm. That's what you seem to be setting up. But no, that's not what happens at all. Like that's resolved by the end of the first act because Homer gets the shitty, RV, and Flanders is like, hey, that's great, enjoy yourself. And that's the end of that. And then they're into the woods, and it's a different episode. It's a different story.
Exactly.
And so that I think is something you see here.
Different writers.
Well, they did have several writers did work on an episode at a time. There were a couple that are just one person, but usually it was written by several different people. You have a lot of different writers and they're pitching ideas, and then maybe the one that gets credited is the one that kind of threw it all together, but they all pitched in ideas, right? So, but in any case, that is a traditional thing in The Simpsons where you have setups for different things, and then it goes in a completely wild direction, and it starts in one thing. The tone changes, exactly. Like you have
the kind of humor
the kind of humor. You have the slapstick humor, and you have the more like cartoony elements, the more like kind of like Looney Tunes. It has more of like a cartoony element to it. Whereas the first half was just an animated sitcom, with a lot of like snappy adult aimed humor, and the whole thing with the car salesman, very funny. But I'm sure many kids wouldn't find that funny. Like they
didn't remember that scene
right.
at all.
It didn't, all you remembered because you saw it when you were a kid. You remember the forest. That's the part that sticks with kids.
That's what I was saying.
That's the magic of The Simpsons, is how they're able to. One of the things about their storytelling style, which I think is very notable and very unique to The Simpsons, is, I guess eventually other shows would start to take a page from that. But at the time that they came out, they were very unique about doing that. And I remember, like around this time, they had a magazine, The Simpsons magazine. It was like an official magazine that would be like for fans. And it would have like
early 90s.
Yeah, early 90s. This magazine must have started publishing around the time of the second season. Okay. Around that time. This one started coming out. And obviously I used to buy it, I used to read it, and And it would have, behind the scenes, interviews, and it would just be about The Simpsons. And in there, the writers were talking about that. They discussed in an interview about how their process was like that, where they would basically sit down and have different ideas for episodes. And I'm sure that in this case, that's exactly what happened. I'm sure that here you had somebody that had an idea. How about if they all go camping and they get lost in the woods, whatever? Like, that's one idea. Okay, that's pretty funny. We could probably do that. That would be a funny idea. And then you have like this other one where they said, well, what about if like Flanders has this really cool like RV and Homer wants to get an RV. So you see, it's like an idea for another episode. And then somebody goes like, yeah, but that's not really enough to sustain a whole episode, though, is it? I mean, how can you really have that go on for 25 minutes eventually?
It happened a lot in Seinfeld as well.
Seinfeld's another example of obviously a show that went all over the place, right? Which was very unique to things. But here in The Simpsons, it was very much like that. Like almost you pick any episode and it's like that. You have the first act is almost a completely different thing.
Yeah.
And then you come to like the second act and it goes in a different direction. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure that it was like that. It was like you had different ideas and you said, well, and obviously they figured, well, having them lost in the forest, that's enough for almost the whole episode because there's a lot can happen there. But this idea of like Flanders and the RV, I like that idea. Let's use that. Mm-hmm. Let's use that as the setup for the camping episode. Because we need to get them into the forest, right? Let's use that as the setup and then we can have some fun with that. And then once they're in the forest, we'll have fun with that too. And so it makes you wonder about the process. Like it really, their storytelling, and the fact that it works, because in any kind of storytelling guides or, when they tell you about screenwriting or writing or any sort of thing, when you are putting together a story and you're structuring a story, they tell you to follow certain rules. Mm-hmm. And obviously in sitcoms, it's very formulaic, and a lot of them tend to follow these rules, especially then. I mean, things are getting broken now, left and right, so it doesn't seem as revolutionary. Yeah. That's one thing that we need to make very clear. This may not seem so revolutionary now because so many shows are like that. Like you brought up Seinfeld, which again, Seinfeld came out after The Simpsons.
Yeah, but it was still 90s.
It's early 90s. Seinfeld obviously broke their own rules and broke the mold in a different way. My point is that when The Simpsons did it, they really were kind of pioneers in that sense, where sitcoms weren't really doing that. Absolutely. Everything was very, like, you look at stuff that was on the air then, even like a contemporary show of The Simpsons, which was also criticized for being edgy, like Married with Children. Mm-hmm. But you look at Married with Children, and apart from it being edgy, apart from it having like racy humor and like all this that kind of thing, the plotting of it is like any other sitcom. Yeah. It's pretty standard, or The Cosby Show, or anything else. Pretty much follows a formula. And The Simpsons never went with that formula. They always just did it in their own way. And then you look at shows, eventually a lot of shows start doing it. Like you brought up Seinfeld, or we could flash many years into the future, and like Arrested Development and like all these other shows started to do really weird stuff with the format, or The Office, or like whatever. Those are other trailblazers. But I really think that The Simpsons does deserve some credit for being a trailblazer early on. Like, it was animated. That was already, in and of itself, was a thing that ended up influencing a lot of things. But also in their storytelling style, I think they deserve some credit for doing things in a way that made a big impact, in the way that sitcoms would start to tell their stories, even live-action sitcoms. So I think it deserves some credit. And
see that man right over there?
Yeah?
He's buying this. Did you know that?
No.
Called me 2 minutes before you came in and said, save the little one. I'm coming down. Here he is.
Yeah, so this episode's good. I agree with you. I think it's fun. I think it does the job. It tells an entertaining story. It still holds up. It's still fun to watch. It's probably one of the best episodes of the first season. Totally. I mean, it's one of the ones where you're gonna put it. You pick that one out, and this one
one
shows.
Of the most memorable episodes.
Yeah, definitely one of the most memorable ones. Still stays in people's heads.
Yeah, it was really fun to watch, to rewatch, and the fact that you just get such a different perspective of the same episode as an adult, and the fact that I still like it for different reasons, but I still like it.
Yeah, same here. So this is good talk. Definitely going to have you come over for the second season as well. I'm sure there's some episodes, more than one at least, that we could talk about, have fun with.
Of course.
So,
of course.
Great.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment or two expressing your appreciation, and if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends, both virtual and actual, on your social media platform of choice. By the way, I recommend you take a moment to check out Petrus's band Oz for some enjoyable Bolivian rock music, and I will be providing helpful links in the description. I'm Erix Antoine, and next time I'll be joined once again by Jason Pollock, and we will discuss The Telltale Head. That's the famous episode where Bart decapitates the sacred statue of Jebediah Springfield. Because this is Pollock, I'm sure the discussion will get a little deeper than just the episode, but I'm also sure it will be fun. So please join us, and in the meantime, stay safe, stay home, and take care of yourselves.
How would you explain it? A woman in Wisconsin is doing the dishes when suddenly she's possessed by a terrifying...